and welcome to our Zoom webinar. Today we have the Professor Barit Mead. He's a director in the Institute of Philosophy in University of London School of Advanced Studies and in the Center Study of Sense. So we'll spend a few more minutes, I guess, waiting for more people to join. But in the meantime, if you have any questions you want to ask, or I'll pass on to Barry to make a small introduction, and then we'll slowly head on into the webinar. Up to you, Barry.
Thanks very much, and welcome to all of you who are joining us. Very nice to have you here, and I'm very grateful to the Society for inviting me to speak, especially as an outsider in their field. So if I say anything that you find technically worrying, I hope you will join in and discuss that with me. So I'm going to share some slides if I can. Let's see if I can do that. Yes, I can. Good. And I will say a little more about the Center for the Study of the Senses, which I direct as we go through. This is a both theoretical and experimental center where philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists work together on multisensory perception, the way our senses combine, interact to produce our experiences of both the world around us and of ourselves. So let me start with the topic of tonight's discussion. And I start with this caveat, which I think you should all have in mind always. Each generation believes its own technological achievements are unprecedented, said a past University of London Vice Chancellor. And each generation is wrong. So there have always been very fast advances, leaps forward. And we tend to think our own technology is going to create human transformation of a new kind, but perhaps we've always been going through these revolutions. So we think now that people are addicted to looking at screens. There's a lot of talk about people being isolated, having less social interaction, less ability to empathize and engage with others because they're lost in their screens. But of course, there was a previous technology that had something like this implication, where people would be lost in books and they would be reading and not communicating with others. And they seem to do just fine. So I'm not scared about the worry of how much screen time we have and use. There's also the fact that if we look at past technological breakthroughs, this man, Saint Anselm, was thought to have invented the art of silent reading. So there were saints who used to sit, or rather there were monks who used to sit with their texts and they would read them by speaking them aloud, and they would be loudly whispering. So in these beautiful libraries, there's quite a lot of low-level noise and chat. And this guy actually discovered that by just turning off the power to his mouth, he could read without making the noises, without speaking them out loud. And the church fathers thought this was a miracle, and they'd get him to read lots of passages and then quiz him about it, and they were surprised. But that was a technological breakthrough. I'm waiting for the next technological breakthrough, which is when we don't have to hear people out loud on their mobile phones. It would be great if somehow we had the technology to be able to receive the incoming call, transform it in our brain, and from our signals to the auditory cortex, we could send messages back that were mimicking speech movements without actually speaking out loud and send them. We wouldn't have to listen to all those irritating calls that people make all around us. Now, people look at new technologies and they think we're losing experiences and capabilities. Holding a book in your hand, the smell of a book, isn't that something which will fast disappear? But we're also getting new capabilities. Swiping on a screen is a new thing which we've acquired. So although we lose some capacities and skills, we gain others. And that's quite funny because young children are around 3 and 4. When you take them to museums and they look at glass cases, they now do this. They try to expand the image they're looking at with their fingers. They assume all images will expand. So it's interesting how soon we catch up with technology. But there are other things that we have to worry about, and I want to start with some qualms and concerns about the appeal to big data. So what is it? All of the people watching this who work in this area will know very well. But the challenge, they say, of analyzing big data is coping with abundance, exhaustivity and variety, timeliness and dynamism, messiness and uncertainty, high relationality, and the fact that much of what is generated has no specific question or is a byproduct of another activity. So these are large, messy, not very well behaved data sets for which we need new analytics and which are being designed all the time. And the ambition of people who are fans and advocates of big data gathering see big data as continuously generated, and they aim to be exhaustive in scope, where N is all, where we would be able to take in all the data that we can gather. It would be flexible and scalable, and this will be at all sorts of levels of scale. Retail purchasing data, CCTV footage, logging of emails, measurements from remote sensors, social media posting, scanning of travel passes and barcodes as you move through cities, dynamic flows of relational data. So there's a lot of data we can gather. And there's a temptation, I think, to assume that we could gather all data if we had enough storage capacity, if we had enough speed, and we had better machine learning algorithms to analyze this data, that we could gather all the data we need. We'd have a complete record of what happened on any day, and we could gather and store and digitize information to preserve into the future. But that's a bit of a fantasy for reasons I want to draw out. So just looking at the scale, so this was a long time ago now, 2012, Walmart reported generating 2.5 petabytes of data every hour related to transactions of over 1 million customers. And Facebook reports processing 27 billion likes per day, probably gone up. But when we talk about gathering data, and you are all data scientists, those of you in the society, and you're maybe not so prone to these mistakes, but the general public tends to have a confusion about what we mean by data. And there is therefore an ambiguity in the term because they think we're gathering data, but the question is, what do we mean by data? Data structures in a computer, data as structured information, something rather more, or data as evidence for a hypothesis, which is the kind of data we talk about in scientific hypotheses and experimental study. Now, it's easy to assume that we have the latter, that we're talking about gathering data, meaning we've got lots of evidence, when we don't. So we may have something that's messy. We may have gathered so much information that not a lot of it is easily usable. If we go on digitizing and just simply generating more and more information, you will just create digital landfill. Instead, we need to think about the data we're gathering, how we curate that data, how we organize it, how it's structured, and how it's going to be used. So this idea that data is not just there, as it were, like chunks of reality, but we have to think of data as data for something, for some purpose. I like this quote from Charles Darwin: "An observation must be for a claim if it is to be of any service." So it's supposed to be data for a hypothesis. But there's a lot of claim on the part of the enthusiasts and the originators of big data that we don't need hypotheses, and that maybe we're at the end of theory, as Chris Anderson said in a famous article in Wired. So what would that mean? Well, it would be this sort of claim. It would be that, that petabytes allow us to say correlation is enough. We can analyze the data without hypotheses about what it might show. Statistical algorithms find patterns where science cannot. Correlation supersedes causation, and science can advance even without coherent models. unifying theories without any explanation, mechanistic explanation at all. There's no reason to cling to our old ways. Scientists no longer have to make educated guesses, construct hypotheses and models, and test them with data-based experiments and examples. Instead, they can mine the complete set of data for patterns that reveal effects and produce scientific conclusions without further experimentation. So it's the idea that mining big data reveals relationships and patterns we didn't even know we were looking for. So far, this has been mainly about retail, but you could imagine scientific discovery this way too. So let's take a deeper dive into the murky depths of large data sets. So here's a working example of the ISADI system. It automatically discovers insights regardless of complexity without asking questions. ISADI's customers can finally learn the answers to questions that they didn't know to ask in the first place. Simply stated, ISADI is digital serendipity. So it does without the human element that goes into both data mining and data curation, and as such, all the human biases that go with it. So instead of waiting to be asked a question or directed to specific existing data links, the system will undirected deliver patterns a human controller might not have looked for. So this is thought to be an advantage. It eliminates the biases and perhaps the limits of our way of looking and asking questions and probing data. And that's supposed to bring about this enormous paradigm shift. So Thomas Kuhn talked about when scientific theory had been progressing to a certain point, and some of the old theories were no longer giving us very new results, and something that was completely incompatible with the old suddenly sweeps the old away, generates new explanations of the data we had, and moves us on. So a paradigm shift is new thinking that happens when current scientific models can no longer explain the phenomena, data in the target domain or answer the key questions. And that's supposed to be what's happening, according to the enthusiasts about the big data revolution. Transitions founded on advances in forms of data and the development of new analytic methods are such that Jim Gray proposes that science is entering a fourth paradigm based on the growing availability of big data and new analytics. But when we talk about finding patterns that we didn't expect or answering questions that we hadn't even posed, we might wonder, why would we care about those questions or about those patterns? So here's an example I've often worried about. When I was a graduate student, I remember going along to hear a history of art seminar. And there, the leading expert of the day, Francis Haskell, was talking about how could art historians tell whether they were looking at a Raphael drawing or a drawing by one of his trained pupils? Was this a drawing by Raphael, by the master's hand, or was it a drawing by the school of Raphael, somebody in his workshop? And there are all sorts of things Haskins proposed. And my worry was that Haskins was roughly saying, the better the drawing, the more likely to be Raphael, which seemed as though it was just assuming Raphael couldn't get anything wrong. And at the time, PDP and connectionism were all the rage, and we're looking at pattern recognition, pattern completion. And I thought, well, couldn't you put all these drawings through a pattern recognizing system and start generating ways of grouping them? And of course, that's would be even more easily done with machine learning systems now. But the trouble is, we might now separate not just into Raphael and school of Raphael, but we might make further distinctions. Raphael in the morning, Raphael in the evening, Raphael after a hard night's drinking, Raphael, after a couple of days off. And we don't care about those patterns. So we are the ones who have to set the limits to what we want to know and how much pattern is useful to us, which are the patterns we care about. And that's not something that the amount of data or the ways of analyzing it automatically can give you. There's another problem, which is that we sometimes want explanations when all we get is correlation. So we know that systems that curate for you choices of music, choices of films, are very successful. No point in pretending they're not. So purchasing patterns might point to associations. If you like X, you like Y, but they don't explain why those patterns should hold. They're not causal claims, they're just good predictions. And if the predictions work, we take the recommendations. So in this case, prediction supersedes explanation. We've got no idea of what's going on. We just get another suggestion. Now, people often say with art, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. But the trouble is, they don't know why they like it. And this system of curating, digital curation of your preferences plays to that. It just says, here's another thing you might like. Doesn't tell you what you like about it. But it also, according to some, means that it looks for the general, it looks for the simple association. It doesn't look for the maverick, unusual choice. It doesn't give you a curveball where you suddenly think, oh, that's something I've never seen or heard before now, and it was interesting. And of course, notice if we remember the quotes I gave you before, they said, because we're doing correlation on such a scale, we don't have to worry about whether we're doing causation anymore, because once the correlation is so big, it really gives you causal information, tells you what's bringing about something else. But we've got to be careful with that. So you all know the difference between causation and correlation and causal explanation, I take it. So some nice examples. If you exercise, the calories burned per minute increase. That's clear. Faster you exercise, the more calories you're using. In the second example, the number of firemen fighting a fire increases as the size of the fire increases. But it's not as though the number of firemen are causing the fire to increase just because they're correlated. Okay, that's not a causal statement at all. It's in fact the inverse. It's the increase in the fire that's bringing about more firemen rather than more firemen bringing about the increase in the fire. And the trouble is, with big data is the bigger the data set, the more likely we are to get spurious correlations. So there's a website where you can find these beautiful spurious correlations. Turns out that in years in which a film is released with Nicolas Cage in it, the number of US doctorates in sociology goes up. So there's no obvious reason why they're connected. And there's lots and lots and lots of these. So it's easier to get spurious and faulty correlations when you've got bigger data sets to mine. And as somebody said rather rudely, you don't find the haystack, you don't find the needle in the haystack by making the haystack bigger. So maybe we still need some guided search. But let's suppose that we are able to gather now huge amounts of data. We're able to handle it, process it. We're able to submit it to machine learning algorithms. The question is, what will we do with all the extra data that we could make available to ourselves? And I'm looking at you, data scientists. Any of the conferences that I've gone to on data science, people say, well, when we're handling big data, we're trying to get people to understand it, we just visualize it. We can visualize what's going on. And I want to say, well, why just visualize the data? You can try to visualize complex data relations and make the data available to people, but you can also sonify data. You can, and I'm going to give you examples of this later. You can musify data. You can take patterns in data and set them to music in which a hearer can automatically extract information that's useful without necessarily having to do more work. And sometimes that's easier when the information you're talking about is temporal information. If you're dealing with spatial information, visualization is good. If you're dealing with temporal information, sonification is good. Maybe haptics, maybe feeling some pressure here or there would allow you to take in information. One of my favorite examples is, I think this work was done for Lexus, but some car manufacturer had an onboard radar and they wanted to convey to the driver information about the radar telling them there was something that was obviously stopped when everything else was moving and it was approaching too fast and therefore you're going to have to take emergency action. So they created the radar and then they said to the engineers, okay, how are you going to tell the driver? And they said, well, we just set off an alarm. But that's no good. If you set off an alarm, the driver is startled and looks around. If you have a blinking light, again, it distracts. The driver looks at the light, it's too late. So it turns out the best way to inform the driver is that we've got a very sensitive part of our skin on our neck, because this area of the neck at the base of the head is very vulnerable. You can't hear what's going on there, you can't see what's going on there, and if anyone approaches from behind, you will be surprised. So you've got tremendous sensitivity. You can feel changes in air pressure. That's why people can say, oh, I knew you were behind me. So what happens with this Lexus car is that when the radar wants to give the driver an alarm, what it does is it gently squeezes the headrest into the neck of the driver, and the drivers immediately slow up and sort of slow down. So that's a way of using information data in real time, but fitting it to what works as an alarm signal for human beings because of how their senses work. We might be able to smell data. There might be a way in which, working in large factories, you could you could smell if things were going wrong, and people would be able to sense this for themselves, but maybe we have remote sensors that will do it too. And I now want to look at ways in which we could use data to make the invisible perceptible and maybe even concrete. So there have often been ways in the past of converting digital information into sensory information. This is Baki Rita, the fine figure of a man on the left of the screen. And this is Amir Amidi, who's doing modern day equivalents of his work. So Baki Rita was looking at what happened to people when they lost their sight. Could they wear a pair of glasses which had cameras and converted the signal about the changing visual information into sensors that would stimulate the skin on their back? And would that allow them to come to feel something that was actually happening in their visual field? Now, when you use this, you're strapped on and you feel these tingling sensations, all a bit odd at first, but after a while, you begin to have a feeling of an object looming towards you, and you could even put out your hand to defend yourself. So we quickly, because of the plasticity of the brain, catch up and are able to use this. Amir Amidi has a laser cane which also pulses, and when we move around the room, we get a feel and a tone that tells us if objects are near or far, and people convert to this very, very fast, very swiftly. So there's what's happening in the Baki Rita. You're taking in optic light signals with a camera. You're converting to sensors that stimulate the skin on the back. So many people have tried these sensory substitution devices. This is, I think, voice. This is where you get sounds in your ears to tell you where things are, and the changes in pitches might give you information about what's in front of you, how far away it is, and so on. Now, we're imagining eventually that technology would become so fluent that you would just not need these rather clunky devices, but you would be able to just have purely digitized information that gave you sort of something simulating real vision. But the trouble is, if we think of how we do that computationally, if we're looking at computer architecture, we are really brains and vats. We are in a position where signals are coming in, but without any real information about what's going on in the world. And we have to use those signals and process them in a smart way to predict what the causes of those signals are. And that's hard to do. So even when we've got connected brains, we still have to figure out how we're going to act in the world and use our sensory information and use any new and enhanced digital information in a clever way. So we might at that point start thinking, maybe we could not just look at sensing, but sensing and moving. And would that give us human-like sensing where we could start to have humanoids behaving like us, or we could extend our powers by having implants. Well, if you talk about whether we can simulate the senses, replace the senses, substitute for those who are losing them with other technologies, we need to know what the senses are. And this is where my work starts really. So how many senses do we have? Usually people, and what are the limits to substituting for the senses? Notice that in the digital world, taste and smell are usually left out altogether. And it's very hard to think how we fit them into the digital capture of information around us. So that when we talk about maybe we could digitize everything and have a complete history of what we are, we're leaving out some of the senses that put us most in touch with the things in our day-to-day immediate experience, and that's taste and smell. And we can capture what's going on in smell. We can measure it, in fact, even though people are rather bad at telling you how the sense of smell is. We've got scientific ways we can measure their threshold, when they notice an odor, the discrimination between odors, and whether they're able to identify them, so we can give people objective scores. But how would we digitize smell and olfaction? It's a very hard thing to do. Now, even if we overcome the limitations of having digital copies, digital records, and digital versions of our sensory information, we're not limited to the 5 senses. And that's why I asked how many senses do we have. So neuroscience colleagues tell me we've got at least 22 or maybe 33 senses. So here's just a few additions. Proprioception. So if you close your eyes now, you know where your hands and feet are without having to see them or touch them. That's proprioception. You have a feel from the inside. We also have our vestibular system, that little set of ear canals that tells us whether we're moving forwards or back, up or down, side to side. And that's important for our sense of balance, along with proprioception. But our senses don't just give us information from more than 5. The senses interact to change one another's workings. And that's what matters when we're going to think any attempt to replicate our senses. You can't do it one by one because the senses are in this constant crosstalk. Here's a simple example of how the senses affect each other. Remember when we used to fly? Take yourself back to those times. You get on the plane, you sit down, strap yourself in, they tell you, they give you the safety instruction. They say, there are 2 doors at the front, 2 at the rear, and so on. Now, you're looking right down the cabin, you see what's in front of you, and then look again when you're in the climb, when you're ascending. Now it will look to you as though the front of the cabin is higher than you are. Of course it is, but why does it look that way? Because you're optically in exactly the same relation to everything in the cabin as you were before when you were on the ground. You've tilted, but your visual field hasn't changed. So what's happening is those little ear canals are telling you you're tilting backwards, and they're affecting your experience of vision to make it look as though what you're looking at is higher, even though that's not a purely visual experience. Okay, so the senses are interacting. And also some of the senses are not so individual. Touch includes the feel of things, the temperature on our fingertips, sensations of pain, kinesthesis, tingling or stinging from hot chilies or spices. So it's not a single sense, it's many. There are also our internal senses. So we have exquisite internal sensors of what's going on in our body. We can sometimes notice when our heart rate has gone up or when we've got more arousal or adrenaline. We notice that our breathing's quicker. We have the feeling of butterflies in our stomach. All of that is interoception. That's the internal senses. So there's a lot of sensing that we're doing. And we've got those exteroceptive senses, taste, touch, smell, sight, looking at the outside world. And then we've got those interoceptive senses, proprioception, and sensing of inner bodily signals. So there's a lot going on here. So if we're talking about how we might replace some sensory losses, the loss of sight or smell or touch, it's not obvious straight away how we do that with digital technology, because we've got to understand those senses. Interestingly, touch is, I've got wonderful colleagues who work on touch, Vincent Hayward in Paris, who's looking at electronic skin for robots. So our fingers are exquisitely sensitive. You can tell whether you're touching wood or plastic or china. I can tell whether I'm touching my cup or touching cloth or touching the table. And yet we don't have wood sensors or plastic sensors on our fingers. Rather, we're quickly computing the change of friction and depression of the skin ridges to know that. So maybe we can digitize some of that. It's a long way to go. Now in sensory substitution, we've got things like this. This is the TDU. This is where a camera takes information about what's in front of you and gives you signals, little electric signals on your tongue moving from side to side or forward to back to represent depth and distance and direction. So here's what's happening. These are visual to tactile devices. But we also have, that's how they convert the signal. But we've also been using sensory substitution for a very long time. We just don't know it. So or sensory extension rather, and we just don't know it. When Aristotle said you're walking along rough ground and you tap the ground with your stick, where do you feel the softness or the roughness of the ground? And the answer is you seem to feel it at the end of the stick. So in that way, when we use tools, we extend our perception of the body's working. So again, it's not straightforward to think of how you capture that digitally. Another form of sensory working is ventriloquism. So when you go to the movies, you seem to see the sounds of the actors' voices coming out of their mouths on the screen, but you can't, it's a screen. So where's the sound coming from? Usually from the side of the movie theater or behind you or under your seat. But the brain sees the moving mouth with synchronized speech sounds it hears, and it simply relocates where the perceived sound is to match where it appears on a screen. So these are the ways that our brains have learned to use information in our environment to do clever tricks. So it's not going to be a straightforward thing to try to replicate them straight away. Now, we've often been doing sensory augmentation. You walk around a gallery and you have headphones and you can listen to someone telling you about the paintings at the same time, so it's not new. But what if we could have what goes on in a gallery be converted into a feeling in our own body? What about feeling something from the painting itself or the work itself? And also, if we're now during lockdown having virtual tours of galleries to get a really vivid, authentic experience with much more immersion, how could we convey the feeling of being in that gallery space, the change of temperatures, you walk from one room to the other, the change in acoustics, the acousmatics of the space you're in? Maybe we can do that digitally, but it's still a challenge, and it's interesting to see how you would capture something like the real experience. For blind people, could you give them a way of, in virtual reality, seeming to explore a painting or what's in a painting as if they could feel in 3 dimensions what they were looking at? Maybe. Again, we've had examples of sensory extension giving us new senses. So night goggles, so that you can see in the dark, is a way of changing the system by adding a new piece of sensory extension to what we have. There's also this magnetic belt, which gives you little sensations on your midriff and tells you when you can feel when you're pointing north. So it gives you a way of navigating just by feel. That's the sort of haptic conveying of data. Not terribly useful, but it can be done. People learn this. These are Google glasses that are being developed, which would magnify very slight changes in someone's blood in their face to see if they were frightened or aroused or angry. So you may actually get recognition of somebody's emotional state by having magnification. Because remember, when your heart rate increases and your emotions are felt in the body, that changes how much blood is going to the head. And if you were able to pick up those signals, maybe you could read people's emotions without them knowing it. This is a guy, Neil Harbison, who visited our lab. He had an implant. He's colorblind, and he's had an implant glued into his head. And this little camera, when it sees the colors of things, it conveys signals to his brain, and like a kind of musical sound that allows him to know what colors things are, even though he can't see them. He's got great problems getting through security at airports because this is actually glued into his head, but he sees himself as a cyborg. Here's a nice way of using data to make the invisible visible, which I really like. This is work by Chris Chafe, who's a computer scientist and musicologist at Stanford. So when you go through a greenhouse and are growing tomatoes, it turns out that as tomatoes ripen at different rates, they give off CO2. Now, he has little sensors fitted to measure the amount of CO2 being given off, and he provides musical tones to indicate those changes in rates of CO2. So as you walk through the greenhouse, you can hear the tomatoes ripening, and you can hear the rate at which they're ripening. So this is something we couldn't perceive, and he's found a way digitally with new technology and musifying data to make it perceptible to us. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend you look at a film, beautiful film called Notes on Blindness, which is about John Hull. He was a minister who lost his sight and then wrote very beautifully about what it's like to be suddenly without sight. And he said, when you're totally blind, you only feel a sense of space by what's in your immediate vicinity. Suddenly voices appear and you didn't know somebody was approaching, and then you think they're still there and you're talking and they've gone. And so your sense of space is shrunk to something very much like peripheral space around you, peripersonal space. But one day he was standing outside and it was raining, and in the garden he could hear the rain falling on puddles on the tin roof of the hut in the garden. And by hearing all these sounds, he said he suddenly knew and could feel that there was a space, that was a volume that was being occupied with all of these sounds around him. And he says rather beautifully, if only it was raining indoors, and they mock this up in the film, I would know where everything was. So again, that's a lovely way in which we could try to overcome some sensory loss with new digital techniques. Of course, we can move and sense differently in VR, and VR has not been as successfully uptaken as you'd expect, and that's often because, going back to our little vestibular system, if you have too much in the virtual world, and you're moving through it too quickly, you can't quite simulate the optic flow that allows it to coordinate with changes in head movement and visual signal. And so some people can feel quite motion sick. If there's fewer things in the environment you're in, it's better. And of course, that problem of coordinating visual information with your vestibular system, this is known to people in Disney. So I did some work with Disney, and their Imagineers took me through the park and insisted I go on every ride. It was terrible. I really didn't like it. I mean, it was very kind of them to do, but I'm not great on some of these things. This, however, was very impressive. This is their mock-up of being in Star Wars and in one of these fighters. So you get strapped into this system, and then it's a flight simulator, so pitch and roll and yaw, and it doesn't go forward. But the visual images you're getting is of, you know, being in one of these fight scenes in Star Wars, and you're turning and you're moving, and it does feel as though you're rushing at real speed. But as they pointed out to me, if ever the film gets out of time with the movement of the machine by milliseconds, people start automatically throwing up, and it's called code V, and they have to close the thing down and go in and wipe it out. It's a bad scene. So we are exquisitely sensitive to how much the visual signals and the movement match, and that's a difficult thing to replicate at the moment. Perhaps one of the best things is to think not of replacing reality with virtual reality, but augmenting it. And I think you can move and sense extra information if you go to if you go to some ancient burial sites or battlefields or outdoors, you could be recreating the buildings and the scenes around you while still feeling the wind on your face and the smells of things in the environment. So I think augmented reality is a great thing to look at. And then, of course, there's the question of, instead of us sensing more, can the environment sense us? Lovely piece of work going on, talking about how people with partial sight or some of the elderly find cities aren't well enough lit. They can't see the pavement well, they might trip up. But if you light them so high, you're creating light pollution. Well, what if you could have a device you carry, perhaps in your mobile phone, and as you walk past one of the lampposts, it's lighter until you've walked past, and then it gets darker again. You wouldn't have to create excess light pollution, but the city could be responsive to the needs of the people in it. I think this is it's a beautiful idea, and something that engineers and cityscape designers are working on. But the real question that I think is for the future and for all of us, and certainly you are going to be the computer scientists and human computer interaction researchers of the future, is to work out how we cross that link between human data interactions. How can we fluidly access data in real time to be able to use it without interrupting and interfering with our normal way of sensing and handling information in the world? How can we take in more information and use it quickly and well by fitting it to us? Nice example is that in operating rooms in surgery, you have all of those noises of the vital signs, beep, 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 and pulses and monitors. But when you're operating on patients when they're awake, as in some cases of brain surgery, it can alarm the patients to hear changes in those devices. And they may be perfectly normal, or they may be a cause for concern. But if you had all those sounds sonified like music, and they went up or down slowly, then the medics could be sensitive to them without alarming the patients, but still able to react in real time to them. These are two colleagues that I've worked with. This is Chris Chafe, who did the tomato study before, and Joseph Parvizi, who's a neurologist at Stanford. And he takes the skull off people's brains who have epilepsy. He puts electrodes on to monitor what's going on, and if they see a site of the seizure, if it's operable, they can cauterize it and the seizure stops. But he can also stimulate the brain while people are in there. But Joseph and Chris decided that they wanted to have a way of getting information about people coming to seizure or leading to seizure that they could have in real time. Because of course, people can't walk around with an EEG on them the whole time and notice changes in their brain. So what they did was they have a way of sonifying the sound of both hemispheres in the brain. So you can have, take a human singing voice, ah, and now oscillate it, ah, and take a different pitch, ah, ah, for the other hemisphere. And when you play the sounds of these oscillations, like the EEG visualizations you usually see, when you play someone the sounds, and this happened to me, I was in Joseph's office and he said, tell me if this is a normal brain, no training. He just played a sound. I said, for reasons I don't know, yeah, that's normal. Next one, no, that's not normal. Next one, too slow. That's right, that's postictal once they've had seizure and crashed. And we find out that people without any training are 70 or 80% accurate at diagnosing whether someone's pre-seizure or in seizure. And this is what they're calling a brain stethoscope. We can use this little device you could just put to the temple to get information really quickly. Now that way of sonifying and musifying the information shows that we're much more able to use it quickly and well. We don't have to be trained, and the visualizations are actually quite slow and laborious, and you need training to understand them. So these are the challenges. These are the things that remain ahead. These are some of the limitations, but thank you very much for your attention and for being at the talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you as well, Barry. It's really fascinating, I guess, to just see how many senses we actually don't recognize having. And I actually have a question.
Yes.
For that slide in the beginning where you said it will be interesting to have a device that would detect speech without you actually saying things.
Yes.
And I tried it, and I think it's really hard to say some words without actually producing a sound.
Yes, it's true. But it turns out we know that when I'm listening to you or you're listening to me, my vocal folds, my vocal cords are actually vibrating at the same rate that you're talking. And a lot of people believe in the motor theory of perception. The way I hear you is by my brain knowing what movements I would have to make to produce the sounds you're making. That's why it's so hard to understand people in a foreign language, because we haven't had that training. But if we're used to hearing someone, our brain can imitate and expect what sounds to make. So if there was a way of us being about to speak without actually having, we could still have movement in the vocal cords, but without it actually having to come out, maybe we could use that information and get it across without having to go through the air and the airwaves for sounds. That's my hope. And then mobile phone communications will be utterly private and easily managed.
Yeah, and I guess the noise pollution as well would be reduced dramatically. Yeah, and again, guys, if you have questions, also feel free to type them in the chat. And there's lots of thank yous for the talk.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
Again, yeah, thank you for the talk. I think it was great. It was amazing. Really found it interesting. Yeah, I guess.
Are there any other questions or thoughts or reflections? I'm very happy for people just to tell me what they think about this, or whether they think these are real problems or they're going to overcome them, or.
I mean, for data scientists, I think it's an interesting way. Yeah, I think there's a question.
Yeah. Okay, Jacques. So you're wondering about the sonification of temporal data. Yes. So if we've got something that's changing in time, it's easier for us to represent that in sound rather than thinking of it as being put on a chart for us to look at. If you visualize it, you have to have a temporal axis, and then you say this move, this move, this move. Just think of those EEG diagrams where you're recording activity in the brain from the two hemispheres, and you're seeing these movements up and down. It's another step of conversion. You've got to look at this visual image, work out what it's conveying about time, and then sort of take that back into your own mind. Whereas if you have something that's already temporal information, music's temporal, sound is temporal. So if you just represent the information by music or by sound, you already have something that's much more close to the phenomenon. I think if you're trying to capture information about large scale spatial relations, then of course visualizing it's good. So I think visual for spatial information, sound or music for temporal information is a much more intuitive and natural way to go.
Amazing. Yeah. Again, then, yeah, another question.
Yes, happy to share some research papers. What I will do, let me, I think I can share one straight away if I can get the reference for it. Yeah, good. I've got a little video that I can put in the chat as well from Eon about how many senses we have, just to show you that. It's called Aristotle Was Wrong. So it's very interesting. If you ask people how many senses they have, they just automatically say 5, but it's always a good question. Why 5? I mean, it's a puzzle to me why we think we have 5, because the more we think about it, the more we realize that we've got many more than that. So I'm wondering whether it's because you're told as a child that, you know, you've got your nose for smelling and your tongue for tasting and so on. Is that why? I don't know. There's a little video about it. I'll also find you a research paper on the things I've been talking about this evening. Let me find that. Sorry, if you were to, Max, if you were to, if any questions come in, just read them to me, because I'm going to try and find this article to put in the chat for you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. But yeah, also if people want to contact you, what would be the best way?
Yeah, I'll put my email in there as well.
And also like LinkedIn or
and LinkedIn. Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn as well. You'll find me on LinkedIn. And on Twitter. Usually either talking about sensory stuff, food and smell, or talking about politics, or talking about academic life. So there's a lot of different things in there, but I'll put all these in the chat. Here's an article on a lot of the stuff I was talking about this evening. That's in European Review. And then here's my email. Oops. And also, I hope when we're allowed back into our universities again, that some of you will come and take part in some of the experiments we do in the lab, because we are always looking for people to come and be tested and to try things out. So it might be fun for you to go through some of these sensory illusions and have experience of some of the funny things we make you try. Also, it would be great, because if people have projects who want to code things, then we would love to have you work with us at some point. I have my researchers who are good at doing sensory experiments, but they're less good at doing the coding, and they need to catch up. So we could do collaborations. If people have master's projects or final year projects, then we could think about doing it. Code in which language? I'll leave that to you. A lot of them work in either PsychoPy or the code in PsychoPy, or MATLAB is usually what they use. So the neuroscientists like MATLAB and the psychologists like PsychoPy, but these are very basic things for you. I think MATLAB's quite complicated, but I think PsychoPy is very easy. A lot of my sort of PhD students and researchers, they all want to use open source coding as well, like Python, to do things. So good for them.
Yep, that's good. So yeah, any more questions? I guess so. What would be example of like you said you need people for different tests. So what would be the tests?
Yes, we try to see. I mean, there's a project that's going on at the moment. It had to be stopped. When you see a hand that's not yours, and that hand is being stroked or stimulated, you see it being stroked, but you feel your own hand under the table being stroked, you often imagine the sensations are happening where the rubber hand is. This is called the rubber hand illusion. And there's a colleague of mine, Antonio Cataldo, who's working with Oculus on a project where if you see a virtual hand and then you have you see something about to touch it, and you get a stimulus on your own finger just before the virtual finger is touched, can you induce a sensation that that it's the hand out there that's having the feelings? So you can see why Oculus are interested in this research. They want to know whether we can have more immersive imagining about having sensations in virtual reality. We often do smell experiments where we try to find out how well people can distinguish different kinds of odors and try to find the individual differences between people. We give you chocolate to taste and play music and see whether certain tones affect how sweet or how bitter the chocolate is. That works. That's quite effective. So there's a lot of good funky stuff that goes on in these labs. Yes, you can certainly apply for an internship. It would be a pleasure to have people there to work with us. So please do contact me.
Yeah, amazing. These tests do sound quite cool.
They're not bad. I think my people in my lab, they often say, "Oh no, what are we tasting today?" And I say, "Oh, we're either tasting, soda or eating chocolate or trying." And they say, "Oh, not again." But they're good. They're good because they got used to tasting coffee under different conditions. Can we affect, because we know the senses interact? Can you change how the taste of something is perceived by the lighting, by the sounds that you're hearing, by the feel of the cup or the cutlery you're using? And the answer is pretty much yes. Which future human interactive device are you most interested in? So I've been looking at colleagues working on the electronic nose, not surprisingly. So you won't be able to simulate what we can do, but for people who have lost the sense of smell, there are dangers. They can't smell gas if gas is leaking in their house. They often don't know whether the food in their fridge is off because we smell and we think, no, don't want to eat that. So if you're losing your sense of smell, a lot of people have with COVID, and some may have lost the smell long term. An electronic nose would be great if it could just give you information. And also, when people are ill, that changes their metabolites and they smell differently. And every disease has its own odor profile. So there's a team of researchers in Haifa who are, not in Haifa, they're the Soma lab at the Weizmann Institute, who are trying to work on an electronic nose that could sniff people to see whether they're giving off the odor of COVID-19. And so instead of having to put probes into their mouths and their nose, you could actually have them breathe into this and it could smell. We're training dogs to smell the distinctive signature odor of COVID. So why couldn't we train electronic noses? These are some of the future things that I think are exciting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I guess no more questions from me, and I guess there was all the questions in the chat. So again, thank you very much for this webinar and for coming.
Max, thank you. Thank you for chairing, and thanks everyone for coming and for your questions as well. It's been a great pleasure, and I wish you well with your own work.
Thank you, you too. Take care.
Okay, and you stay safe. Bye.
Bye.